Hi everyone, welcome back to English for You. I'm Pat.
And I'm Mike.
So yesterday we looked at the story, or maybe one of the stories, of bagels.
That's right. Now what are bagels? Well, they kind of look like donuts, but they're quite different. They're not sweet, they're not a dessert, and they're made in a different way. How do you make a bagel? Well, basically, you take some dough, the basic material that you use to make all bread, but then you boil it before baking it, as you would with normal bread. But most bread you don't boil first. You might boil an egg or some noodles, but not your dough for bread.
But there is a story why this happened. So bagels may have first been baked in Poland by Jewish people, where for a long time they couldn't just not bake bread, they couldn't even touch bread because it was considered holy to Christians, and there were a lot more Christians than Jews in Poland. The kings were Christians, so the Jewish people, that was the rule they had to live by.
Of course.
But it was changed.
That's right. This was obviously tough for Jewish people because bread is a staple of Europe. It's one of those foods that people eat all the time. So the law was changed by a king maybe back in 1264, and he said, well, Jewish people can make bread now, but they have to boil the dough first before they bake it, which is, of course, how bagels are made. But this is just a story. We don't have this as a fact. It's something that's kind of come down through time. But that's basically the legend, the myth of the bagel. So we've covered one of our ring-shaped breads, but we haven't talked about donuts. We've covered the savory, the kind of salty bagel, but now it's time to move to dessert, to the sweet, sweet donut. So let's go and check out our article about donuts right now.
Reading.
There's a whole history behind bagels and donuts. Donuts might look like bagels, but they are different in many ways. These sweet treats are made by making sugary dough and then frying them in lots of oil. One thing that donuts and bagels share is an uncertain past. It's difficult to say how donuts came into being. Some people believe that the first donuts were Allekoeks, a fried Dutch dish. However, foods that are similar to donuts have been found in ancient Native American graves. One legend takes place in the 19th century and is about a woman who was named Elizabeth Gregory. Elizabeth's son was a young sea captain who traded spices. She used his spices to make a special fried bread. Before she put it in the oil, Elizabeth put nuts in the middle of the dough. She called this a dough nut. As the story goes, Captain Gregory loved his mother's sweets so much that he took them everywhere. Soon, the donut was an American favorite. Isn't that sweet?
All right, so yes, we're talking about donuts. Now, donuts are something you might eat as a dessert, maybe for breakfast, or maybe just as a snack in the middle of the day. But what does the article tell us about these sweet treats? It says donuts might look like bagels, but they are different in many ways. Sure, they're round, they're circular, they have a hole in the middle, but that's about it.
Yeah. I should also say that not all donuts have a hole in the middle. You can get the donuts that are kind of full of cream, full of jam. I like those.
No, they're good too.
I like the ones with jam inside. But anyway, these sweet treats are made by making sugary dough and then frying them in lots of oil. So again, it's dough, it's that mixture of flour and water and other stuff, but here it's sugary dough. Something that is sugary contains lots of sugar. We talk about candy is a sugary treat, you know, ice cream is sugary mostly. There are lots of other things, sugary drinks. We say kids shouldn't have too many sugary drinks, it's bad for their health. This dough for donuts is sugary, and then people fry it.
That's right. So it's not baked, it's not put in an oven and cooked in dry, hot heat. No, this is put into oil and cooked at a high temperature in super hot liquid oil. Frying is what we do when we fry things. It can also be used as a verb, and we also, this has been fried. We could use it as an adjective. French fries, obviously, are fried. Fried chicken is fried. We often use the term or how it's made in the name of the food, but donuts are fried in the same way. And sometimes when we fry things, we don't actually call that stuff dough. We might call that stuff batter, B-A-T-T-E-R. But it's basically the same thing. It's just a little bit wetter, a little bit more liquid. All right. But if you're cooking it in hot oil, whatever it is, you're frying it. As it says, here's a good tip for all you chefs. Let the oil become hot before you start to fry the vegetables. Yeah, if you're going to fry anything, I would recommend get a thermometer, one of those things that tells you how hot the oil is, because putting it in when the oil is still too cold, it doesn't end up tasting too good.
Yeah, the oil gets all over the vegetables and they are oily in that case. Oily is similar to sugary as an adjective. Lots of oil, it's oily. So we go back to the article and see that one thing that donuts and bagels share, as well as their ring shape, is an uncertain past. So we're saying we're not really sure about their story again. Like bagels, we've got an idea, we've got some legends and old stories, but there's no absolute 100% this is what happened.
That's kind of one of those things about food history. The first time someone makes a new food, there's usually not someone standing there writing it down and taking pictures. I know that even bubble milk tea here in Taiwan, there's a bit of a controversy, different stories about who made it and when they made it. So it's also interesting. Let's look at what we know about the creation of donuts. Well, it says it's difficult to say how donuts came into being. Kind of like with bagels, it was either a long time ago or a couple of people had the same idea around the same time. So it's hard to know, it's hard for us to be sure how these donuts were created or came into being. When something comes into being, it's created, it's made, it's invented. Someone does something and boom, there it is for the very first time. Now, we wouldn't use this about like living things, we wouldn't say that a kitten came into being from the mother cat. No, it was born or something like that. But for things that people think of or create or make up or something like that, yeah, we can say it came into being in this place on this date because of this. This is where it first appeared.
Okay, so let's look at one of these stories, and this is going to involve a Dutch word which I'm sure I'm going to say wrong.
You can do it.
Well, let's see. Some people believe that the first donuts were oliekoeks.
Early cooks?
I
don't know.
Maybe a fried Dutch dish.
That sounds good.
There's fried as an adjective. So in that sentence, we just used an appositive. This is a noun or noun phrase that explains or defines the noun that comes before it. There are two ways we can use appositives. The first is restrictive appositives. Now, these don't require commas, and they're 100% needed for the sentence. For example, my brother Dean is a math teacher. Dean is an appositive here. It's explaining my brother. It's giving more information to talk about which brother the speaker is mentioning. So we need it, and there are no commas. The other kind is a non-restrictive appositive. This provides extra information, but this information is not 100% necessary for the sentence. The one in our article is an example. We don't need to add the information a fried Dutch food or whatever it was, but it does help us understand the Dutch word oliekoek, or however it's pronounced. Here's another example of a non-restrictive appositive. In Tainan, a city in the south of Taiwan, people can find lots of great local foods. So that bit in the middle, a city in the south of Taiwan, it's got the commas. We don't completely need it for the sentence. Therefore, it's a non-restrictive appositive. So these donuts seem to have come from a Dutch food.
That's right, the oliekoek. Now, Dutch, this is an adjective that we use to talk about things from Dutchland. No, we don't, because there's no such place. But there is such a place as the Netherlands. This is a country right there, kind of on the North Sea between Belgium and Germany in Western Europe, I would say, very close to the UK. And yeah, the country is called the Netherlands. Sometimes casually it's called Holland, although that's not the proper name for the full country. But we don't say Netherlanders or Netherlandish as the language, we say Dutch. So Dutch people speak Dutch, they eat Dutch food, and they live in the Netherlands, all right, or Holland, as some people might say. If you've heard of the city of Amsterdam, that is probably the most well-known city in the Netherlands, the most well-known Dutch city, and maybe where they were making oliekoeks, those things.
Those things.
Pre-donuts.
Those early types of donuts.
Baby donuts.
So that is one version of the story, but as we see, however, foods that are similar to donuts have been found in ancient Native American graves. So in parts of America before any Europeans came, they find some kind of food that looks like a donut. So
Native American, like Indian people?
Actual people who lived in America. We don't really call them Indians, we call them Native Americans.
Sure, or First Nations people.
That's right, yes. Whatever we call them though, these are ancient cultures. Ancient means very old, dating back a long way in time. So these graves, they are very old graves. They've been in the ground for a long time because a lot of Native American cultures are very old. They've been in the American continent for a long time. Here's another example of ancient. Memphis was the ancient capital of Egypt. Now it's Cairo, but before, in the olden days, in ancient times, it was Memphis.
Oh, okay. And another thing you might find in Memphis even today are graves. Places where people were buried under the ground. Of course, they have graves all over the world. People will be buried in graves today, or of course, if you go to old temples or churches or historic places, you might see the grave of a king or a queen or something like that. But the person dies, they dig a hole in the ground, they put the person's body in there and maybe put a little stone with their name on it or something to mark it, and that is a grave. So basically, these Native Americans would die, and like in a lot of places, they put things they might use, you know, in the afterlife, in heaven or wherever, in the grave, and they had something that looked like a donut.
Yeah.
But not in the Netherlands.
No.
Not a Dutch grave, a Native American grave on the other side of the ocean.
Right, so we've got donuts coming in all kinds of places, and here's another story about how donuts were made. We see one legend takes place in the 19th century.
Okay.
So only a couple of hundred years ago.
1800s.
And is about a woman who was named Elizabeth Gregory.
Doesn't sound Dutch, doesn't sound Native American.
No, sounds British basically.
Yeah.
So a legend, this is an old story that is well known, but may or may not be true. And even if it is true, maybe some parts of the story have kind of been added to make it a cool story. It's not the exact events that what happened. There are a lot of legends around, a lot of old stories, and we never know how much of it is real fact and how much is just interesting storytelling. But let's find out about Elizabeth Gregory.
Yeah, and how does she relate to donuts? Well, let's read on. It says, Elizabeth's son was a young sea captain who traded spices. Now we're getting into food a little bit because her son was a sea captain. He had a boat and he traveled all around the world, but he was carrying in his boat spices, things that you use to flavor your food, which, you know, back in the old days were big money, you know, like people trade oil today. Well, 400 years ago or 200 years ago, they were trading spices to make their food tastier. And as I mentioned, he was a captain. A captain is the person in charge of a boat or a ship, or an airplane, or a spaceship too. But generally, and of course, originally, it started as the boss of a boat or the ship. The captain's in charge of the ship, gives the orders, everyone says, aye, aye, captain, and they run off and do their job because the captain, he or she, is the person in charge. For example, the captain told his crew to prepare the ship for a storm. I believe the proper term is batten down the hatches.
It is indeed.
I was a captain. No, I wasn't.
We also learned that Captain Gregory traded things. He traded spices. To trade means to buy and then sell and exchange these goods for other things. He might have just bought something somewhere for money and sold it for more money, or he might have traded. He gets spice by selling other people, say, clothes or cloth, something like that. He then trades the spice and says, I'll give you the spice, you give me this wood, and I will sell the wood. It's all about business. It's all about giving one person something and getting something in return. And when we talk about trade, we usually mean on a very large scale. Boxes and boxes of spices being bought and sold in different parts of the world. Here's a sentence using trade. India began trading with Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. And he was trading spices.
Yeah, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, spices are basically tasty plants or, little bits of plants, and we use them to flavor our food. Absolutely. If you're adding things like oregano or tarragon or curry spices or things like that to your food, you're adding these bits of plants, often dried and crushed up or something like that, to your food just to make the flavor better, to change it a little bit, to make it more interesting. We add all sorts of things. Pepper, I guess you could say, is a spice. Salt would not necessarily be a spice. And of course, we also have herbs, which are very similar. But these different things, spices, herbs, they flavor our food and make them tastier. For example, Claire added some spices to her tomato sauce to give it more flavor. Otherwise, it would just kind of be tomatoey and a little boring.
Yeah, we often think of spices as adding a hot flavor. So,
often?
yeah, not always, but often. Okay, so here we've got this sea captain trading spices, but it's his mother, Elizabeth Gregory, that does the actual act related to donuts. We see that she used his spices to make a special fried bread.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Right, fried bread, that sounds like a donut.
We're halfway there, but we're not talking about the shape or the name, so let's find out more about this fried bread she was making. Before she put it in the oil, Elizabeth put nuts in the middle of the dough. She put nuts in the middle of the dough.
I see where this is going.
We're going with this. All right, so yes, she put nuts in the dough. Now I'll let you think about that while we talk about what nuts are. Nuts are a type of food. Basically, it's a dry fruit that is found in a shell. So when I say fruit, no, don't think about oranges or apples or things like that with a soft outside. Think about something like pecans or pecans, walnuts, hazelnuts, things like that with a hard outside that you generally have to break open somehow, and then you eat the inside, which is softer, but maybe, still a little bit hard and crunchy. We often dry nuts. You can crush them up for more flavor for your food, or just eat them on their own. Nuts are very healthy. They have good healthy fats inside, and they also are good with lots of different things. You can eat them with breakfast, put some on your ice cream. Nuts can be used in lots of good ways. Let's have a look at our example sentence. Nuts and fruit both grow on trees, not on the ground. And that's why the peanut, it's not a nut.
Okay.
So she took some nuts and put them in the dough, Pat. Nuts in the dough.
She must have called it a nut dough.
Oh, so close.
Okay.
Try it again.
All right, I'm going to read from the article.
Yep.
She called this a dough nut.
Boom, there we are. So it was a nut, a dough with a nut in the middle. It's a dough nut, but you're actually right. Nut dough would make sense too. But anyways, that's the story, or that's how the story goes. As we read, as the story goes, Captain Gregory loved his mother's sweets so much that he took them everywhere. Look at what my mom made, he said to all his friends, and they went, that's nutty. It's dough with a nut. It's great. But this is, of course, just a myth. It's a legend. Again, we don't have the true history. We don't have photographs of Captain Gregory with the first donut and his proud mom. As the story goes, this idiom tells us that, well, this is what the legend is. This is what has been passed down to us through history, or this is what I heard. I didn't actually see pictures of it. I wasn't there myself. But as the story goes, is basically just telling us this is maybe a fairy tale, a myth, a legend, and this is as much as we know. True or not, who knows, but that's the story.
Yep, but one thing is certain, as we see here, soon the donut was an American favorite. So presumably maybe Captain Gregory and his mother were American and they sailed around, they shared the donuts around and people thought, these are great, let's make them ourselves.
Yeah.
So donuts are everywhere.
Isn't that sweet? So there you go. The final sentence of the article is kind of a joke. If something is sweet, it's kind of cool, it's awesome, it's great. Sweet, that's good news, you know, you might say. Or also, it's a sweet thing for his mom to make them for Captain Gregory. And of course, donuts being a sugary snack is also sweet. So there you go. A good way to wrap up day 2 of our look at bagels and donuts.
Yep, but we're not quite finished yet. Let's go to today's For You chat question.
For You chat.
All right, so our chat question is about donuts, but it's about amazing donuts.
Ooh.
Well, the question really puts it down. It says, what's the best donut you've ever tasted, and what was special about it? Think of all the donuts you've had in your long life. Which one sticks out as, oh, that was the #1 donut. That was the peak of my donut eating experience. I'll never taste a tastier donut.
Well, I don't know if I will ever taste a better one, but one that I will never forget are the donuts that you can buy at the Goose Fair in Nottingham, my home city.
Okay.
It's a big traveling amusement park. It comes to Nottingham for a week every year, and the donuts they sold, at least when I was a kid, were so fresh, so hot, like straight out of the oil. All they had was sugar. There was no cream, there was no jam, no fancy toppings, no matcha or anything like that. But they were just so hot, fresh, light and fluffy that one of the best parts of going to the Goose Fair was getting those donuts.
Okay.
So I will never forget them. They're a part of my childhood.
Nice.
Have you got a favorite donut?
Well, there's a famous Canadian donut chain, donut restaurant that, you know, is well known in Canada. Tim Hortons is what it's called. They've opened a few around the world, and I was in Shanghai not long ago, and hey, there's a Tim Hortons Canadian donuts in China. So we went and got some, and we just got the little holes. It's donut holes. It's basically just a ball of the donut dough or batter, so it tastes the same, but you just get different flavors. So we just ordered a bunch, like 12, and they just mixed up a bunch, and we got them out, and we expected these nice sweet donuts, and we bit in, and it was rosong inside. It was pork floss inside, which isn't terrible. I don't mind some rosong occasionally, but it was kind of a surprise, and it wasn't the way I remembered my favorite Canadian donuts with dried pork floss inside. So maybe not the worst donut, but the most shocking donut I've ever had.
There we go. What about you guys? What are your favorite donuts? Have a chat about it. And that's all for us. For English for You, I'm Pat.
And I'm Mike.
We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.
There's a whole history behind bagels and donuts. Donuts might look like bagels, but they are different in many ways. These sweet treats are made by making sugary dough and then frying them in lots of oil. One thing that donuts and bagels share is an uncertain past. It's difficult to say how donuts came into being. Some people believe that the first donuts were Allekoeks, a fried Dutch dish. However, foods that are similar to donuts have been found in ancient Native American graves. One legend takes place in the 19th century and is about a woman who was named Elizabeth Gregory. Elizabeth's son was a young sea captain who traded spices. She used his spices to make a special fried bread. Before she put it in the oil, Elizabeth put nuts in the middle of the dough. She called this a doughnut. As the story goes, Captain Gregory loved his mother's sweets so much that he took them everywhere. Soon, the donut was an American favorite. Isn't that sweet?
Vocabulary Review.
Fry. Camilla fried the onions in butter until they turned a lovely brown color. Ancient. The teacher gave the children a lesson on ancient Greece and showed them pictures of many old temples. Captain. The captain ordered the sailors to sail the ship into the port because a big storm was coming. Trade. The city of Venice became rich by trading with countries around Europe and Asia. Spice. Amanda added some spices to her dessert to change its flavor. Nut. Theo wanted a snack, so he bought a bag of salted nuts from 7-Eleven.
智慧小补帖
Sugary. Grave. Legend.
以上节目是由活用空中美语制作，活用空中美语杂志，请洽询全国各大书店。如欲索取试听教材，请来电02-2364-4000 02-2364-4000，或上网查询，网址是 www.english4u.net www.english4u.net